welcome to this, our FITT forum, our first intuition think tank forum, where over the last year or so we've been examining a lot of hot topics affecting the accountancy sector and sometimes even the broader economy. We've done forums looking at recruitment, particularly online recruitment. We've been looking at retention of staff. I know that seems to be a real problem at the moment for a lot of sectors, and something actually I think we can pick up on in this morning's forum, actually looking at the impact that some of these technologies might have on retention of staff and attraction of staff, the ability to maybe widen a recruitment net for your talent pipeline. But welcome this morning. Thank you for joining me. I'm Gareth. If any of you don't know me, I'm one of the directors at First Intuition. So for the last few minutes, we've been running a little poll, just looking at where people in the audience feel they are on their digital journey. And actually, I'm going to share, so I'll end the poll and share the results now. So hopefully everybody will be able to see that now. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it is a reasonable normal distribution there. So I'd like to set out responses that would map a reasonable progression from not really starting digital transformation, still maybe using more traditional spreadsheets, through to full tactical and strategic use of these technologies and things like data analytics, and relatively few at each end of the scale. Still got a few who are pretty early on in their journeys. But actually the highest response from a personal perspective is people who are using digital automation tools such as cloud-based software. I guess that would be particularly prevalent in accountancy practice. A lot of the firms I work with are using the likes of Xero, Sage, and some of the add-on apps. So that seems to be the most successful. Fewer who are using things like data analytics. Looks like a little bit of introductory use of data analytics, but very few who feel that it's embedded either at a tactical or particularly at a strategic level. So that's from a personal perspective. And actually those results fairly well mirrored when we think organisationally. And in fact, I would argue organisationally, it looks like we're even a little further behind with the higher proportion who haven't really started or are still relying on spreadsheets. Again, the highest result is where there is use of some of the automation tools, but again, very little in terms of use of data analytics at this stage, and very few who feel that it's kind of successfully embedded. So, no, thank you very much for filling in that poll. I think that's very interesting, kind of what I expected to hear based on conversations I've had over recent months with a lot of the employers that we're working with. So we'll make a start. In fact, this might date some of you, and it certainly dates me, but I thought I'd start with a little quiz and think, does anybody recognize something like this? Now, when I started my career as an accountant, I mean, this is analysis paper, which I'm sure a lot of us who are of a certain vintage might remember. You would have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these in every file that you worked on, particularly when I worked in audits. You know, I worked in a practice firm, you know, and that's, you know, where you lay out your trial balances, where you show your journal adjustments. And the problem with this is, if any of you remember, sometimes a single A4 sheet wasn't big enough. It wasn't enough. So some of you might even remember the old A3 analysis sheets that you could fold out so that you could have even more columns to work with. And in fact, you might even remember sometimes that wasn't even big enough. And so you'd sellotape. And if you remember sellotaping sheets of analysis paper, so you had enough rows and enough columns. And in fact, sometimes even that wasn't enough. You can see I've been like Blue Peter and prepared all this earlier. But sometimes you would have to sellotape sheets and sheets and sheets together. Now, apart from, you know, it made accountancy more like a school art project or something, if you remember. But obviously, the problem with that was it was fairly cumbersome. And the big issue, if any of you remember, is it was really difficult to make changes. You know, if you were looking to change one number in your sheet, you'd be there with, in fact, if any of you remember, you'd typically fill these in pencil, wouldn't you? You'd fill these in pencil because there was often an awful lot of rubbing out and recalculating across your rows, down your columns and such like. Now, what basically came along that then replaced the need for all these sheets of paper, and in fact, this was pretty much when I was in my first year or two training as an auditor, these sheets kind of went out the window. And in fact, if I'm thinking back a little bit of history lesson here, so in 1978, a chap called Dan Bricklin was actually sitting in a classroom in Harvard Business School, And he was watching his tutor, who wasn't using sheets, but was using a big blackboard and was actually doing the kind of exercise, columns and columns, rows and rows, changing numbers, rubbing everything out. The whole class were changing numbers, rubbing everything out. And Dan Bricklin thought, this is just pointless. This is absolutely ridiculous. This is boring, it's repetitive, it's time consuming, and I'm sure you will all remember it's horribly prone to error, and the errors then carry forward sheet by sheet. So Dan Bricklin, in cooperation with a friend of his, actually came up, and I don't know if any of you might remember VisiCalc. Now VisiCalc was the predecessor, and some of you may remember Lotus 123, which in itself I think was the predecessor for what I'm sure we're all very familiar with, which is Excel. So basically computer-based spreadsheets, which are, I'm sure we all use every single day. And in fact, you'll be aware, obviously Apple is a giant monolith of an organization now. The growth of Apple, some of you might, if you've read the likes of Steve Jobs' autobiography, the growth of Apple was actually based on not Apple I, which they didn't sell very many of, but on Apple II. Apple II was really their first breakthrough product. And actually, the reason people bought Apple II was not particularly for the hardware, it was because it contained VisiCalc. And VisiCalc, you can imagine if you're an accountant used to all of this stuff, and then somebody shows you the likes of VisiCalc, which you can do it all and it updates automatically, and changing things can become a job of seconds rather than a job of hours. That was what drove that sales of Apple II, which I think is what kind of drove the success of Apple as we see it today. Now, if any of you have ever come across Planet Money, there's a podcast called Planet Money, which is quite useful, but there was one of their podcasts where they were talking about some of this stuff, and they reckon that since 1980, which is the year that VisiCalc really went big, since 1980, in the US alone, there have been 400,000 accountancy clerk jobs lost. Needless to say, the automation has replaced a lot of that repetitive rubbing out and recalculating for sheets. So obviously some jobs lost, but actually what they also said is that whilst there were 400,000 accountancy clerk jobs lost, there have been 600,000 other accountancy jobs created. Because you can imagine with spreadsheets, it makes doing budgets and forecasts and reforecasts and rolling forecasts so much quicker and easier. It just wouldn't have been economical previously when it was all on sheets of paper. Things that I'm sure we all love, like sensitivity analysis, what if analysis, what if I change my price 2% and I reduce my material cost by 1%? That's a nightmare if you're doing it on sheets of paper, but it's very quick and easy on a spreadsheet. Variance analysis, things that we take for granted, it actually empowers the role of accountants. And this is something I'm hoping we're going to get into a little bit today. So that's our little introduction. Now we're going to be hearing from a few speakers and panelists over the next hour or so, but I want to start off with, I think we've got Mark and Rob with us, who in my mind are kind of expert industry observers on some of these areas. So I'm actually going to go to Mark Proctor first. Mark, would you be able to just briefly introduce yourself, maybe give us a little bit about how digital technologies and data analytics, how that's changed your career path in recent years?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. So I'm Mark Proctor. I'm a qualified accountant with too many years post-qualified experience, probably coming up to around 20 now. Back in January 2021, I became what's known as a Microsoft MVP, which basically means that Microsoft thinks that I talk too much about their technologies and therefore they like to give you an award for it. And that is primarily in the field of Microsoft Excel, but also into Power BI and other areas. And even today, I am a reporting automation consultant, and I specialize in Power BI, Excel, and Power Automate to try and take regular accounting processes from hours and days into minutes. Now, in terms of my career, so I remember that ledger paper. I remember all of those elements, and I think in practice it was very difficult for digital technologies to really take hold, because you ended up working on so many different clients that had so many different platforms. But when I moved into industry, that's what really made changes in terms of these digital technologies. For me, it was about learning how to automate my tasks. Now, that may sound like you need digital technologies for it, but in all honesty, before you can even get into that automation process, you need design standards, you need naming conventions, you need to understand how data should be structured at a basic level to even achieve that level of automation. So I think the key part is not necessarily about software tools, but about setting up the environment first so that we can then implement those technologies. And through these, when I worked in industry, we could shave 20 hours off a month-end process. We could shave 19 days off a year-end process through thinking about and structuring our data and how we're going to, across the whole arc of that implementation, from input all the way through to reporting your PowerPoint presentation, how is all of that linked into a single unit rather than just implementing each of those things as separate elements. So in all honesty, it's less about, in my opinion, it's less about the software, it's more about the approach and the thought process and getting the basics right. And that makes the biggest change in terms of automation.
Thanks, Mark. And actually, you raise a really valid point. We're going to talk a little bit later. First Intuition, we've been developing some courses in digital technologies and data analytics. And one of our straplines for it is journey before tools. I think it's very easy to want to jump to learning Python or jump to knowing how to use Power BI, but these technologies are useless if you don't know what you're trying to achieve with them, and if you don't have a degree of consistency within an organization on what the purpose is. So thanks, Mark, good introduction. So I'm now going to turn to Rob. Rob, if you can introduce yourself, because you're coming from the opposite direction to Mark.
Yeah, completely. I am Dr. Rob Domenico, and I have no accountancy experience, so I'm probably not welcome at all. Yeah, I'm a data scientist by trade, so I have a PhD in applied statistics. I had, up until probably recently, very little experience in the finance industry. My background was in kind of machine learning, data science applied to sports. So I've worked for various companies doing that. I've also ran my own consultancies, kind of doing predictive sports modeling. I had taken on CTO roles in a variety of companies in similar type of areas. So my experiences and kind of expertise are more in the kind of the data science skills, the coding skills, the technology skills, and everything that kind of goes around that. So all the stuff that, I fully agree with what Mark was saying. Everything he was saying is completely spot on. But that's not just literally from a finance point of view, that's from anybody trying to adopt these types of skills. And yeah, so I am the outsider who has been welcomed in, and I'm very glad to be here.
Thanks, Rob. And I thought that would be really quite interesting. So we've got Mark, the qualified accountant, who's now been pulled into the kind of digital and data. So we've sort of got the insider looking out. And then we've got yourself, Rob, who's more of a data background, who's been pulled into the world of finance. You've kind of got the outsider looking in. Yeah. So that'll be a useful contrast to hear from. And actually, I mean, because you deliver training in things like Python, don't you, Rob? And, as you've been drawn into delivering to accountants, I know you've been doing some work, for instance, with the ICWA to top skill accountants in things like Python. How have you had to modify what you would normally deliver to data professionals for an accountancy audience?
Yeah, it's a good point. I've got my first book on Python that's available now. It's called The Python Book, if anyone's interested, from all good retailers. So yeah, primarily I've been teaching Python as part of what I do, and I've been doing that to kind of data scientists, statisticians, people with a quantitative background probably for 4 or 5 years. And probably a year or two ago, ICWA reached out and said, well, we want to start offering those digital skills to our members. But the kind of big difference that, especially I've found, and I'm a SME with the ICWA, so there are various talks I've done on, how you can adopt these types of approaches and adopt programming over, say, spreadsheets, is actually, you can't, the data professionals don't want, or financial professionals don't want to embrace it in the same way a data scientist would, because a lot of the time they need to know the kind of what I can do as opposed to how I can do it. And that's kind of the big difference that I found, is that really it's about kind of opening their eyes to what's out there and what can be achieved. For example, automation of, say, you've got 100 spreadsheets you need to amalgamate into a single spreadsheet. You can do that type of task in 10, 15 lines of code, and it will run pretty much instantaneously. So again, going back to what Mark was saying about time saving, a lot of this can be done, and it's, do it once, run it many times, and there are lots of benefits around it. but the kind of approach has had to change, because I can't necessarily teach a lot of people who are kind of interested in the same way I would somebody who wants to practice it, because they more need to understand what can be done and be able to link that back to a specific or something within the business to kind of allow them to embrace what's out there.
Thanks, Rob. Now, actually, and coming to Mark and to Rob, and I'll start with Mark. Actually, I mean, the first big question, and there was a lot of sort of scare stories, particularly a few years ago, that the robots are coming to take away our jobs. I mean, does automation, AI, machine learning, data analytics, does it mean that we can sack all of our accountants now? What do you think, Mark?
Well, I think that's a question with several elements to it, because if we group automation, AI, machine learning, and data analytics all together, then we're treating all of those technologies as the same, which I think is a tricky place to put them all. I mean, if I start with automation as an example, I mean, we spend, most accountants, I think, probably spend 30% of their time shuffling numbers around on spreadsheets, just moving numbers around. And when you're paying them £50,000, £70,000 a year, and you realize they're spending 30% of their time just moving numbers around, then it's not particularly good use of time. And most of that is stuff that follows consistent rules. So things that you could literally train a monkey to do it. And that's where a lot of the inefficiencies come. So that's the bit that I specialize in. How do we take out that element? Rob mentioned about automation through Python. Through Power Query in Excel, we have those same tools available to us, that we can take 50 spreadsheets, 100 spreadsheets, we can amalgamate them all together, we can change that data into a more useful structure. So for me, it's more about, in terms of automation, freeing up accountants to do the job they're actually meant to do, rather than moving numbers around on spreadsheets. Now, in terms of AI and machine learning, from an accountancy perspective, you see tools that kind of automate the accounts payable process. And to date, I've struggled to see implementations that have really delivered the benefits on that. I mean, much like your example earlier, Gareth, about, we lose however many jobs and we gain however many more. What we actually see is the accounts payable jobs are lost, but then you need more involvement from IT to support that. When those errors come through, you need more involvement from the financial controller to dig through thousands of lines of data to then work out what's really happened. So you end up pushing a lot of those tasks elsewhere. So at the minute, I think in terms of AI and machine learning, there's a lot there, but we need to be really careful about it and make sure it's implemented correctly, which a lot of organizations are trying to do things on the cheap. And so therefore, it's not really implemented correctly. In terms of analytics, I think that's where we have the big opportunity, because accountants have always done some level of analytics. So they've done kind of descriptive analytics, what happened, why did it happen? But in terms of prescriptive and predictive analytics, that's where accountants, I think, can really add value. So it's about taking away that shuffling of work away from them, so that they can move into those added value areas, which for the last 15, 20 years is what we've been saying the finance profession should be doing.
Thanks, Mark. And interesting there that you're saying maybe data analytics offers big opportunity, given that the poll suggested that that was an area perhaps people feel less familiar with, less comfortable with. Rob, what's your thoughts on this?
I mean, if these things could get rid of accountants, it would make my bills a lot smaller. But no, in reality, I echo everything Mark says. I think in terms of, like, it's never going to be, everyone was always scared, kind of like you said, that automation would put everyone out of work. It's just going to redistribute us. And I think this kind of upskilling and, being able, just identifying areas of your own personal development where, you maybe lack the skills. If it's digital, it could be like, increasing your Excel skills, or it could be learning programming. I kind of come from the programming side, so I'm always going to be a big advocate of it. And I think, with cloud and moving things into cloud and that kind of increase in what's out there now, there's certainly benefits in it, but it doesn't come at no cost. There's a lot of kind of opportunity spend you have to do to get yourself there. So, organizations have to kind of figure out what's going to work for them. In terms of like the AI, machine learning, analytics, I think a lot of the lines are very gray on it in terms of what's what. People kind of, especially in, startups, companies say, oh, we're adopting AI. and it's a lot of the time could be no more complicated than analytics applied in a kind of bigger cloud environment. But there's opportunities there for people who have ideas, and I think AI, machine learning, even analytics, they're not going to solve your problems if you don't ask the right questions. And that's, you know, as a consultant who kind of works with companies doing those types of things, that's really what we need to figure out at stage one, is what are the questions, the business questions you need to answer before we can even go down those routes. But there's a lot of opportunity there for companies who are willing to embrace it.
Thanks, Rob. Now, in some respects, it's quite good that hear that the two of you coming from different sides of the argument really are in a degree of agreement, but actually I like a fight sometimes. So I'm going to try and kick off a fight now between the two, because I mean, Mark, you achieved a certain level of fame with your blog, Excel Off the Grid. And as you said, you're a Microsoft MVP, which I believe means you're in the top 100 users of Excel out of what, 750 million users or something. So that's pretty lofty. But then Rob, I know you deliver a course, for instance, called Getting Over the Excel Hump. So I'm kind of thinking, you know, and I mean, the question I'll put to you actually is, you know, how long can accountants keep holding on to spreadsheets like Excel? Are there better tools available? And are we talking big money? You've both mentioned the idea of investment or opportunity costs. Are we talking big money for this stuff? I might come to you first, Rob, actually, on this one.
Yeah, so we've kind of, you know, one of the big talking points on Excel this year was when the COVID case story where they didn't actually have enough space for all the data. And I think, you know, in terms of data and the amount of it and how much you're using and how much you have, that's where kind of programming becomes the bigger opportunity. And also the link into kind of machine learning, data science, automation, in terms of packages out the box and what you can do with it. Now, for a lot of people day to day, the spreadsheets are still going to play a major role for kind of quick data analysis. But, you know, again, you can automate lots of really complicated tasks very easily in code. And I'm sure you can achieve similar things in Excel. But there are, you know, using languages like Python, R, anything like that, it kind of opens up flexibility and in many ways allows you to go cloud-based. And I think, you know, when we're talking about full automation, if we can move away from Excel in as is, and we can kind of go to things like AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Azure, buzzwords I'm sure people may have heard and maybe don't understand, but Python natively runs really well in these environments. And Python don't pay me anything, I just enjoy programming in it. But it offers a lot of opportunity that when you want to move your business more in that way, can be of big benefit. I can see the counter argument of, you know, for most people, Excel is still a very good tool. And when I talk about getting over the hump, I'm on about what you can do if you embrace a bit of programming. And there is also a point, you can write Python and use it in Excel. You know, the two things can live together. So, you know, there's a lot of things you can do, but it's understanding probably more what is there and what you can do if you embrace programming.
Yeah, I mean, you referenced that example that I'm sure we'll all remember of the spreadsheet that didn't have enough rows to cope with the amount of data it was being expected to crunch. And, you know, we'll all know that data is just huge amounts that we're all having to deal with. Even at first intuition, you can imagine the number of, you know, mock exam marks that we're receiving each year is just huge. You know, and, you know, I mean, some people suggest that, you know, data is the new oil. I'd argue that actually that's not true, because oil is a finite resource and can only be used once. As you've already referenced, Rob, you know, data you can use over and over again. You can run these kind of programs many times. Mark, what's your view then on, you know, clinging on to Excel? Are there more powerful tools we can be using?
I think going back to the COVID instance where that data was lost, I mean, that they were using a file format from Excel 2003. So they were using a 20-year-old version of file format for Excel. So therefore, I think that's, you know, if you use a 20-year-old version of anything, it's not really fit for purpose of what you're using it for. I mean, Excel these days, I mean, it has 1 million rows on the spreadsheet, but within the data model, which exists in the background in modern versions of Excel, anything from 2016 onwards, people have handled 1 billion rows of data. So there is now an unlimited amount of data that you can hold inside. I would say unlimited. There's a limit in terms of the size of your hardware, but that exists inside Excel today because Excel's moved a long way in the last 20 years, but people are still using it as if it's 1997. And that's one of the problems with Excel, or people using Excel. Now, can we replace Excel? Are there better tools available? The answer is yes, there are better tools available, but it all comes down to, do you want to pay for those tools? Can you train people on those tools? And how are you going to deal with changes in your business when those tools come along? Now, Rob's mentioned about programming. In Excel, there are multiple programming languages. There's M, there's DAX, there's the formula language, there's VBA, there's Office scripts. So there's lots of programming languages that exist inside Excel, and each of those specializes in doing specific activities. So for me, it's not about getting rid of Excel, but understanding how we use it in the right way. When you go, we can load 1 billion rows of data, then, you know, is the level of data really the issue? Is it the fact we don't understand what Excel does in 2022? But going back to your original question, yes, we can get rid of Excel, but we have to replace it with something else, and no single tool can really do that. I mean, if you think about an iPhone as an analogy, I mean, an iPhone, is it the best camera? No. Is it the best gaming device? No. Is it the best torch? No. But do most of us use it for a camera, a gaming device, and a torch? Yes, because it's the second best tool. If we cared enough about things, we would buy a better camera, we would buy a better torch, we'd buy a better gaming device. So Excel is kind of like the second best tool that we have. So if we care about certain areas and certain technologies, then let's specialize in those areas and really get those technologies to work. But for everything else, then we still have Excel that we can use.
Thanks, Mark. And maybe just to draw to a close this sort of first phase of discussion, we're starting to talk there, I guess, about, you know, the skills people have to use some of the technologies. I mean, when we talk about digital skills, are digital skills quite technical? Things like using Excel more, or even being able to code in Python, or are digital skills actually softer skills that many of us perhaps already have? What's your thoughts, Mark?
I mean, in terms of digital skills, I mean, there's a lot of talk at the minute about no code, low code automation, which basically means that somebody else has written up all the code in the background for you so that you don't have to undertake those activities yourself. So we're taking a lot of the benefit from the digital technologies, but applying them to people who don't have that knowledge and skill to implement them or to code it themselves. Now we end up with these environments, with these frameworks. You think about Python, as Rob knows, we can do almost anything in Python, right? But when you've got such a loose framework, we can do anything. Is that actually useful? Because when we have a framework around what we want to use, if we know that something calculates correctly, we know how something operates, then we can work within that framework to ensure that we get the results that we want quicker. Now, the thought of, the stat that 80% of spreadsheets contain errors, well, that's because 99% of spreadsheets aren't stress tested properly. 99% of spreadsheets aren't, they don't go through a proper rigorous process. But yet we seem to think that if we move to Python or another technology, that our human nature will suddenly change and that we'll suddenly stress test all those things properly, we'll then implement that properly. Think that Python hasn't got any bugs. Well, Python doesn't, well, it might do, but whatever we build could have 100 bugs, 1,000 bugs. We've got to debug all of those things to start with. So let's apply that same thinking that we would apply to a software application like Python. If we were going to code it ourselves, why don't we put that into Excel and go, let's stress test this. Let's make sure that the tools that we're using, when we create this finance model, let's test it. Let's make sure it works. We need to drive out those errors. It's not Excel that creates the errors. It's the people that create the errors. And then we don't do anything to look for them or to fix them.
Thanks, Mark. And Rob, in terms of the blend of skills, I remember talking to you a few weeks ago and you suggested you thought that around about half of digital skills were actually softer skills.
Yeah, and kind of going back to what Mark was saying, Python, Excel, nothing eliminates bugs. I think there are reasons both ways to kind of use either, but actually, as an organization, if you understand, it goes back to the question, why, what do you need to do? What's your problem? In many ways, one may be better than the other, suited to what you need. But if you don't know what you need and you're not prepared to adopt this as a group, as a company, as an individual, then you're not going to get the momentum and you're not going to be able to understand what needs to be done. I use the analogy, I used to work for a consultancy company in London, and the owner owns a football club in London who are very famous for adopting data as their driver and digital skills as such. And the reason they're very good at it is because from the top down, everyone believes in it. If everybody buys into it and you can understand what you're supposed to do and what the benefit is, that's going to have a much bigger effect than bringing in 5 Python developers to build you some code. Because exactly like Mark said, you may not solve the problem because you don't understand it. And so for a lot of people on this call, the kind of key will be understanding what you can do, how data can help, what digital skills you need, and whether, just doing like what Mark said, being more rigorous with checking your spreadsheets is going to be appropriate. Or whether you're at a stage where you need to do a cloud migration and you need a lot of your stuff in the cloud running automated all the time. And then the kind of skills you need may be different. And so it's not one versus the other. It's not a kind of war against that, but it's understanding what the need of your industry is, your company. And you may need to lean on outside expertise to help you with that. And, there are lots of people who can, but ultimately don't let them drive your decision. You understand your business better than anybody. Just let them facilitate that and help you get to where you want to go.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Mark. That's a great sort of start to our discussion. But now I'd like to turn to a couple of employers. I wanted to get the sort of employer perspective on these areas. So we've got Ryan and Andy joining us. So Ryan, can I just ask you to introduce yourself? Actually, just talk a bit about your role as digital specialist.
Morning, everyone. My name's Ryan. Unfortunately, I've not got an exciting journey of certifications and qualifications as the last 2 speakers, but I am a digital specialist at Larkin Gowan, a top sort of 40 UK firm. I'm based in Norwich, or I say based, but now that we're sort of digital and remote and COVID's hit, I'm based in Galston, so about an hour away from the Norwich office. I do actually work through all of our 6 offices and have done for the last sort of 4 years, working with all our clients, many businesses, many staff, and sort of loving tech and trying to sort of push and promote it in a big organisation to sort of assist and facilitate all of our clients, hit all their goals and sort of make sure they're making the most out of it. In regards to my role, it's sort of when I first took on the job, it was a very new role, not seen in the sort of firm before. So I have done a lot of learning as I've been on the role with sort of trying to get onto as many webinars like this, which has really sort of helped and sort of moved me forward in my thinking, but also trying to get my colleagues and managers and their support behind me has been fantastic. And so, yeah, that's really my sort of journey to start with, and I'm sure I'll go into more detail shortly.
Fantastic, thanks, Ryan. And Andy, give your superhero backstory, if that's all right.
Yeah, morning. Thanks very much, Gareth. So I'm the Chief Auditor for Bank of Ireland's UK businesses, where I've been for about the last 6-7 months now. Prior to that, 6.5 years as the Chief Auditor for BGL Group, who run the Compare the Market website. So a very big data-driven type organisation in terms of how we operated, but also how we thought about and utilised data. Alongside that, I also have the pleasure of working with FI and deliver some courses. So I am one of those accountant people. I'm an ACCA qualified accountant, and I teach through a couple of FI's offices as well. Hence why I'm here today.
Thanks, Andy. Well, coming back to you, Ryan, actually, and I know we've got quite a few people who work in practice on the call. It'd be quite interesting. Can you just give us an overview of some of the technologies you do currently use?
Yeah, so we use multiple types of technology, such as optical character recognition, so OCR. Many of you might know it as. We've got AI chatbots. We're starting the journey with data analytics software as well, which is obviously nowhere near the levels of the last 2 speakers, but we're starting that journey going forward. We use household products such as Dext, your QuickBooks, your Xero, Sage. I'm not going to go through all of our softwares we deal with, but we're in the cloud space. The biggest thing for us is using sort of the OCR technology, as Mark said earlier, shaving them that time off every week, month, year end is massive for us. So we're trying to improve the efficiencies throughout the firm, not only for us, but for our clients as well, so they can not have to spend 3, 4, 5 hours keying in data. There's no need for that anymore. We use data analytics software when we're able to link with new clients, potentially quoting, getting health scores, other things like that. So the software bolts into their accounting software, obviously if they're on cloud software, and it can give us an overall of where they are at, sort of just a health score out of 100 to say if it's sort of 30%, there might be a load of work for us to investigate and look into, or if we're looking at the 80, 90 plus, then fantastic, we'll take them on any day. So so yeah, that's just where we're at.
Do I remember rightly, Ryan, that is it Inflow, the data analytics software you use?
We use obviously Dext, Precision now is named,
okay.
But we have got our audit team, because I'm based in business and private, but our audit team looks at Inflow, yes.
Yeah, just mention that because that's the one that actually is embedded now into some of the ICWA exams. So something that students will be getting a degree of exposure to. We may hear about that from David later, actually. Well, can I come back to that question that I was asking Mark and Rob earlier in terms of, because as employers, obviously with teams who are using these technologies, is it getting rid of jobs? Andy, I might come to you first, actually. So is this reducing the need for accountants?
I wouldn't say it's reducing the need for accountants. I think what it is doing is changing the role. So it's changing the role from being sort of very process driven to, arguably the more interesting end of sort of what being an accountant is about. So it's removing, or it's beginning to remove, some of the simpler end of transactions. Those firms who I've worked with who are a bit further ahead, you can see them automating what were the simple processes, so things like purchase ledger. And what it means is you're spending more time then on analysis and judgment. And one of the things that we often talk about a lot is we start with the concept of data. And it was interesting listening to Mark just on that point of, you've got to get your data standards, your data structure right in the first place. But actually the real challenge is how you then take that data and turn it into insight. How do you turn it into something that is very useful, that your business can use and then use very effectively? And that's really the direction of travel that you're beginning to see utilized in terms of how you can change your data set from something that is more of a process to get you to an end to genuine insight that helps you run your business. And that's what I'm seeing sort of accountants, finance professionals getting much more involved in now in terms of business performance. It's tell us what the real drivers are and what are the levers that we can pull, rather than necessarily put a set of financial statements together, because we can do that on a largely automated basis. I think one other thing that it is useful just to pick up from Mark as well, really interesting that point about, people make errors in spreadsheets. One of the things that we did use at BGL is some software called Oak that actually does that overlay of spreadsheets. It checks the veracity of spreadsheets exactly to that point. If you can begin to eliminate the errors, actually it becomes much more usable and more better. And sometimes what you can find is either the software or the process that you're trying to run through can get a bad name, almost because you haven't gone through that thought process of how do we do this end to end and how do we eliminate errors. And it's when you eliminate those errors, actually you begin to get genuine efficiency.
Thanks, Andy. And coming back to you, Ryan, I mean, I see the perspective of a firm that is recruiting more and more every year, so it doesn't seem like there's a reduced need for accountants at your firm, and I see this across so many employers at the moment as well. But I mean, what's your view on the impact of automation on the number of roles in accountancy?
Yeah, I'd echo everyone in here. It's reducing the boring jobs, to be perfectly blunt to you. The days of sitting there and typing in a big Excel spreadsheet. Well, I've not been on your paper and pen and paper like yourself, Gareth, but unfortunately.
Not as old as me, Ryan.
No, but the days of sitting there for me, when I first started for the first sort of 12 months, it wasn't every job, because we were sort of having these clients who were using the software, which are available to us, but mostly weren't. It's only been in the sort of last 5 years we've had a massive shift, which has been great. But the days of sitting there typing in the date, the description, the amount, and then uploading them, or literally working on the spreadsheet to get your sort of accounting system all there, and that's removed, which is great. It's not making the accountant extinct in my eyes. As everyone said, we're able to offer more value to all our clients. We've got staff now who are sort of sitting there and having forecasting sessions, talking about where the client wants to go, how they can get there, looking at the data, which is done within can be done within sort of hours rather than months. So we've got all the data there. Why are we not using it to look forward, predict where we're going? And there is software which aids us in that. Not only that, I'm having the conversations with clients about these, which is 10 times better than me ringing up, chasing for sort of bank statements and other things like that, because we've got everything linked. Just to add on to the last comment, we use Dext Precision as well, which can sort of talk to the software and look at the data, and it will pick up and throw to us any sort of anomalies. So if we've got data where we're saying that every month bank charges should be exempt, or if we're even putting 20%, that'll flag up on the odd chance and you've put 20% this time. So we've got the data analytical software there assisting us for the errors, because if it is rubbish in, you will get rubbish out, which everyone sort of alluded to.
Thanks, Ryan. Actually, I mean, you talked there about getting rid of some of the more boring work that I think accountants typically do. In fact, to my mind, it gets rid of the stuff that gives accountancy a bad name. Perhaps we can now, rebrand accountancy as a much whizzier, much sexier, much more impactful career even than it has been recently. I wonder whether that's actually going to help with things like retention of staff and even recruitment, bringing people into a profession that's seen as being cutting edge. And given it's such a massive issue at the moment, I mean, do you think, Ryan, that this makes working in accountancy a more appealing career path for, Gen Z, for instance?
Yeah, definitely. This, for myself, sort of the last 4 years as I've grown in the role, we're now getting clients who I was going out for a monthly visit potentially and doing the month's worth of data in this one visit over the space of 9 hours, being stressed out because we might have lost paperwork, we might not be able to get everything we need. Whereas now I'm able to speak to the client daily. I'm getting the information daily, so I'm able to process it. We're having the communications daily, so it's building these relationships for me and the client, me and my staff who I'm working with. Not only that, for Gen Z growing up, they've been used to instant messaging all their life. So WhatsApp's your Facebook Messenger, MSN a couple of 10, 15 years ago when I was growing up. So all your instant messaging, that's how we're now going. Businesses are now going to become, the up and coming businesses will be Gen Z based. So they're not going to be wanting 9 months out of date data at year end. They're not going to want to wait months for a reply for a question. They want to make key decisions. A lot of them are spontaneous, so a lot of people are going out and taking out loans and want to do all these big ideas. So we need the data there in real time for us to back up, make these decisions, and not only that, make our lives easier by using the automation.
So you're saying that working remotely actually improves relationships with clients?
It has done in many scenarios. I still think there is a place for face-to-face. I don't think you'll ever beat that, but for the one example I mentioned just a minute ago, I was going out every month for 9 hours, 8.5, 9 hours. That was stressful because we needed to get the whole month done in that one visit, because we were going there getting everything given to us. If we lost documents, we were chasing up. They're a haulage company, so we're chasing up drivers for receipts and other stuff like that, which was just a nightmare. But now I'm speaking to my client daily. Sometimes I might not, because I've got everything and I don't need to, but he's got a contact number for me direct. So we unfortunately, when Liverpool lose, I get a lot of stick, but after last night's performance, that ain't happening anytime soon. But yeah, it's just building them relationships up. So we're just speaking on the odd chance for 5 minutes here or there every couple of days on the phone or text, and it's just, yeah, the relationship's never been better. Not only that, with that, we're able to then have these conversations because we've got all their bookkeeping up to date continuously, daily, about moving forward and having them more exciting conversations where the client feels like they're getting the right value for money then.
I mean, the sense I really get, I mean, both from this morning, but lots and lots of conversations, is that kind of automation doesn't replace human ability. It kind of amplifies human ability. It, allows us to add far more value. Andy, just coming back to that point around kind of recruitment, retention, I see a very important role with these sorts of skills developments in actually recruitment pipelines. What's your thinking on this?
No, very, very much so. And I think it really begins to broaden out the skill sets that you're potentially looking for, either to bring in or to develop within your team. So If I go back a few years, the internal audit skill set was quite often traditionally someone who'd maybe trained as an external auditor, was a qualified accountant, and basically then moved to internal audit as a bit of a change within their career. I think we're looking an awful lot more broad now in terms of our thinking from that perspective, and also in the skill sets we want to develop. So, if I think about my graduates that I brought into places like BGL or Bank of Ireland, yes, we will still put them through ACCA as an accountancy qualification because we want them to have the financial acumen to understand the business. But we also actually then train them quite heavily on things like C-risk, which is more of a technology-based qualification to really understand some of the digital drivers behind the businesses. And then we train them on some of the tooling that we're quite keen to use within our audit function. So I mentioned Oak is one. We use a package called IDEA as well, which is very much a data analytics tool. And it goes back to that point of, it's actually a very usable piece of tooling that you don't need to code to actually then utilize within your audit team. It gives you that sort of frontline data analytics capability. And the beauty of it is that can probably get you 70–80% there as an internal audit team. Then if you need someone specialist to support you beyond that, that's when you bring someone additional in. But it's that ability to really take that broad view of, I can use the data that the business is using to drive its decision making, but then I can understand what that data means, and that actually allows me to provide insight and actually allows me to provide value back into the business. So an awful lot more breadth now in terms of what we're looking at for skill sets. And certainly if I look at from a recruitment perspective, there's no one background now that I would point to. We take people into internal audit from all sorts of different backgrounds, with partly that being that breadth of thinking is going to help us.
Thanks, Andy. And actually, I might bring in Louise at this point, my colleague Louise. I don't know if you just want to quickly introduce yourself and your role in this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gareth. Yeah, so I'm Louisa. I'm leading our digital program here at FI. I'm a chartered accountant by training, nearly 20 years these days, I think. I've always been interested in IT and data, and actually prior to becoming an accountant, I did actually do a master's in artificial intelligence, natural language processing, so I've always had that interest, but then my career path led me down accountancy, and the things I've been involved in since then, like with forensics, I've always been interested in data and analysis, and then recently with teaching, again, the parts of the qualifications that we focused on those areas very much, what's led me here today with the digital program, which is a very exciting place to be right now.
Yeah, I mean, you've been involved in quite a lot of employer conversations with me in recent months, and actually helped rolling out our kind of current programs. What kind of messages have you been hearing from employers, and how do they tally with things that Ryan and Andy have been saying?
I think it very much echoes everything that's been said today through, first of all, that poll that you did, Gareth, what we found from that poll, and then what our other speakers have been saying. I think everyone is at very different stages of this journey, aren't there? Both organisations and individually as well. So you get pockets in some organisations of people doing exciting things, or companies that are very much further advanced, and then others much less so. So I think for a number of people, there's a lot of fear and sort of scared about where to start on this. So we've got different ends of the spectrum, people embracing it and people who are quite cautious about it, and it's where to start. We've talked about so many different aspects today. It's lots to take in and digest. But I think increasingly other things that employers are telling us, it's to stay competitive. This is necessary because we're competing against companies or audit tenders, for example, with audit, where other people are offering this. And I have increasingly heard of stories where we may not win an audit tender because the competitor had these tools in place. So there is definitely that necessity that's really, really creeping in. So doing nothing isn't an option. And I think every business being a data business is all stuff we can do, whatever size the business. It isn't just the big guys out there very much. But something else that's stood out, and I know lots of employers have been interested in, and something has been alluded to in what we've discussed so far, but not directly mentioned, is data visualization. So taking that analysis, those findings, and thinking about how we tell our story, I think that's really important. That's something we can all reflect on, whatever stage we're in the journey, thinking about those key messages as we're telling people, whether it's our clients, whether it's internally within our team, within the organisation. There's a lot that we can all do to keep on working on those skills, that lifelong learning. We can all work on that to really make sure those messages are being taken home. I was on a podcast last night and we were talking about very much these topics. And we were talking about with data visualization. Often data analysis projects can fail because people aren't actually telling the story at the end clearly enough. The messages aren't being communicated. So I think that is a big bit of it as well that is really important. And as I say, it's something we can all very much embrace.
Oh, thanks, Louise. That's really fascinating. And actually, at that point you were making about competition, I want to come back to Ryan, actually, because working in a practice firm, actually, how have you seen these technologies affecting either the competition you suffer or the way you can compete?
So yeah, as a practice, competition has grown, but so has our offering to new clients. We can now also deal with more work because with our clients all over, we're able to embrace a digital technology. So especially those that are cloud-based, location is now not a restriction. Of course, it's making meeting in person difficult, but it can be done. Meetings over Teams and Zooms work, but this allows us to give great client service using the tech to receive documentation, to process their data, using the automation to get things done quicker. So then we're able to offer more or even take on more work because we've sort of got all this freer time. I wouldn't say it's free because we are very busy, but we're reducing the time of keying in data, which is allowing us to then sort of offer more management account situations, forecasting, as we just touched on, visualization. So being able to see where we want to go and build that picture with our clients to say that this is where they want to go over the next 5 years, and we're able to do that because we're not sitting there writing in bank statements and getting data which is 9 months out of date. So yeah, the competition has grown, but so's all of our offerings.
When we chatted, you said you've got clients in Scotland, for instance, now that you work with, but equally, I guess you compete potentially with firms much further afield if they're operating digitally. So it's becoming a much more fluid, I think, environment. Something I do hear from some employers when I'm talking about digital technologies, data analytics, is they say, oh, we're too small for that. Our clients are too small for that to be relevant. Do you think there's such a thing as an organisation too small for this to be useful, Ryan?
Not at all. Brand new firms are able to accelerate rapidly. They're in a very good position that they can open the door and say that they only want to roll out these digital processes, and that's the only way. As we touched on by our previous speakers, that they can get it from the top down or bottom up, whatever way you want to look at it, that's the way they want to be. They want to embrace digital, so all of their clients can come through the door. They can put them on the digital journey and make them embrace it. Or if a client wants to come in and give them a bag of paperwork, they can say, sorry, unfortunately, we're not the right client. But the software we use is available to everyone, and it's not the most highest of prices to have that clients or customers can go out and buy it themselves, and then the accountant can log into that, or mainly we're able to offer discounts, which many accountants can, because obviously that's part of the process. But not only that, it's allowing us to be able to be forward thinking and being able to grow and accelerate by using all the sort of tech which is there and using it as ammunition, rather than being afraid of it and staying clear of it.
Thanks, Ryan. I mean, I know there's a firm we work with training their accountants based in Bolton, I think, who they only started in 2016, I think, and they're already recruiting 5 or 6 trainees a year, clearly expanding very quickly. It's fully digital services. I mean, Andy, back when you were at BGL Group, I know that you were running the internal audit function for a business that had 10 million customers. How big was your team at that point?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we had a dozen people, and exactly to that point of the technology that we were able to utilize actually allowed us to be an awful lot more nimble in terms of our overall approach. So, I've mentioned a couple of the packages that we used to use and some of the mindset that we brought, but we were able to cover a huge amount of ground, and some of the journey that we went on there, was partly beginning to use that tooling on individual audits, but we got to a point where we were using it, I think, fairly similar to what Ryan's saying. We were running monthly tests on some of our key control areas, such as access privileges into our IT systems, and in effect we were then able to almost just run that in the background and automate our testing, which means that what you're doing is you're spending your time dealing with the exceptions rather than necessarily trying to test a sample and manually go through some of that process. So it was hugely powerful from that perspective, and team size was not an impediment. In fact, if anything, it probably made us a little bit more agile in the way that we approached our work, and allowed us to kind of move and focus where the data was potentially telling us. Just a great example to close that up is, if you looked at Compare the Market, which was a very, very data-driven organization, because we could do the analysis of data organization-wide, so partly within my function, but more broadly, it was very easy to begin to find customer pain points, the things that weren't working particularly well. So what you could see was customer behavior changing, often they would drop off a journey. That allowed you to then go in and try to understand why they were dropping off and fix that particular pain point. And you could literally be doing this in real time. So, week on week, you'd have a new pain point pop up. Right, what's the problem? Let's fix it, move on and find the next pain point and the next problem. So it really just changed the way that you work. And I think it links to Ryan's experience of, you're doing this thing almost daily. You're talking to people daily rather than maybe coming in and auditing them once a year or once every particular period. And that actually strengthens some of the business relationships that you've got as well.
Fantastic, thanks. Well, that's some really interesting points coming out of there. And actually, I'll just finish this sort of phase by, because each of you, when I was chatting to you before this, you raised kind of similar ideas about staffing again, because if I remember rightly, I think Andy, you mentioned that you've got a colleague who had gone back to Malta for a couple of months and actually still managed to work perfectly effectively. And Ryan, I think you talked about, you've got a colleague who actually lives in Spain, so has a nice swim every morning before logging into work. So that's obviously a big impact potential on recruitment nets and the flexibility of people's work-life balance. So thank you very much for that. Well, kind of move into our sort of third and final phase of this webinar. We've heard from kind of industry observers, we've heard from employers. We're now going to hear from the awarding bodies, the accountancy awarding bodies. So we've got ICWA, ACCA and CIMA with us. And I wanted to sort of ask them to start with just kind of what sort of trends they're hearing from their members around the impact these things are having. And I'll come to you, David, first, if that's all right, from the ICAW.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on, Gareth. And I'm David. I'm a technical manager at ICAW. And in terms of trends from our members, I think it's interesting because our membership is fairly spread between, it's about 50-50 business practice and about 50-50 large and small companies and practices within that. So it's a reasonably diverse group, and we're hearing, I think, some things which are kind of common across the whole gamut of that, which is a sort of certainly a rise in not just sort of interest in from themselves in data analytics, but in the kind of expectation that they're hearing from their clients that that's something they're kind of hearing and expecting that will be coming more and more. But then there's also quite significant difference in also how they're tackling it, because we've got people who are sort of up in the big four and the top 10 and so on that maybe will have dedicated departments or resources looking at these things. And a lot of the firms and the people in the kind of the middle tier who are perhaps looking at their audit trainee intakes and their other kind of people and trying to identify the ones who are perhaps more technologically minded and more interested in these subjects, and then trying to direct them towards specializing, or across the spectrum, we're also seeing a lot of them who are looking to external partners, so taking on external services or consultancies, bringing in external experts when they've got these kinds of issues to tackle. And I think that's really interesting in that, I think actually building on what we were hearing before, that, this isn't sort of the unique province of the big players in the market to be able to leverage some of this technology. And, there really is an opportunity for smaller firms to either sort of start out digital or to be able to be a little bit more flexible and take things on in that way. So I think it's really quite an interesting time to be in the profession. I mean, we have, I think, had more sort of higher student numbers in recent years than we've ever had. So I don't think there's any sign of the kind of slowdown or either of sort of removal of accounting jobs or kind of replacing of them with data analytics jobs. But I do think there's certainly some interesting trends there.
Thanks, David. That's really useful to hear. Clive, can I come to you now? Clive from the ACCA.
Hi, Gareth. Hello, everybody. Yes, so I'm Clive Webb from the ACCA. Part of a team called Fresh Insights, which does the research into the profession, and my domain is really the finance function area. So I tend to look at it from that sense. But in history, was an IT auditor, and yes, I do remember all that, sticking that analysis paper together, Gareth, many years ago. I think in terms of what we see, I think the pandemic has certainly acted as a motivator, a shockwave for a lot of organizations, big and small. And I don't think we see a substantial difference. We've seen a lot of investment in automation. We've seen a lot of investment in data, and the realization that, as we've talked about, I think Mark talked about, it's that shift to predictive rather than descriptive analytics. So looking forwards, looking more towards what might happen, because organizations, I think, have been somewhat disturbed in the traditional cycles that we've seen. And what we're seeing is the adoption of that technology, that recognition, I think, as Mark and Rob said, that data is so important. And getting that data model right in organizations is absolutely fundamental. You can't have analytics without having the right data model. And going back to, I think, some of the things Andy said as well, it's about how the organization drives that data. So again, very data-centric organizations. That's becoming increasingly relevant. And I think the next step maybe is that data model, as a profession, we need to think broader simply than the financial data, because we're increasingly looking at non-financial disclosures and non-financial decision making. So the data model becomes more integrated. The only way we can manage that model is using the analytical tools, be it Excel, be it Power BI, be it Power tools from Microsoft, be it whatever it may be, what your preference is. But I think, as Rob said, it's the right tool for the right circumstance, and understanding the business problem first levers that. So there's a lot going on. It's complicated, but it's actually quite interesting and, I'd say, dynamic times.
It's definitely not dull, is it, Clive? That's for sure. Christian, can I turn to you now from CIMA?
Yeah, hi, so I'm Christian from CIMA. I'm a senior manager in the education department, and I've been with the education department for about a year now, but I've been with CIMA for over 10 years. And you know, our research looks at what's happening with the actual businesses and how this impacts the role of accountants. And I think, you know, being in danger of regurgitating what everyone said, I think there's the points I'm going to make are very, very valid in terms of what everyone has said. So I think definitely job roles are changing. I think increased automation has taken over kind of some of the repetitive and rational tasks. And it's freeing up the accountants to do more, spend more time on value creation. You know, I think the automation is working more on the cost efficiencies, and so the accountants can spend their time on more on this value side of things. Definitely a move from diagnostic and descriptive into predictive and prescriptive analytics. In fact, we had a Future Finance Forum in the US. Some of our colleagues over there, they had a whole bunch of CFOs, quite a lot, about 60 or something CFOs, and some workshops. And they said in the first month of the pandemic, requests for predictions and projections increased by 30 times. So, you know, it's really important for us to understand how these roles are changing and where they're moving to. I think specifically in terms of data analytics, some of the feedback we're getting from our members is, and actually our students as well, it's quite interesting because it's a combination, I suppose, of what Mark and Rob were talking about. But they really want to be highly skilled in deep reasoning, so a bit of, you know, critical analysis, data visualization, so that communication side that you were talking about, storytelling, which is really important, and then data interpretation. Those are the skills that they really want to focus on, or the feedback we're getting from them. But it is also very important for them to understand the technology that's out there and how you use that technology. I think Clive made a very, very good point that I want to mention as well, is it's not just about the structured data anymore. We need to look at all the unstructured data, and we need to look at the technology that's going to help us make sense of that unstructured data. I was reading something about natural language processing the other day and how good that is at actually converting unstructured data into data so that we can make better decisions in the future.
Fantastic, thanks, Christian. I can see Clive's just popped a link in the chat box to a piece of research that ACCA has been done. I mean, it would be quite interesting to hear from each of you about, you know, what have you been doing to support members and to support organisations that you work with in this area. And Clive, since you've popped something in there, I might start with you actually, just a quick overview of some of the key things that the ACCA has been doing.
So I think probably there are two strands to it. One, obviously the output of the Pressure Insights team is about the research and helping people understand the trends. We try and make that very action focused. So what are the steps you need to take? And then we're building our CPD programs that help people understand things like Python, RPA. One thing we haven't talked about, which is probably very relevant to this, we have all this data, we need to keep this data secure as well, so that we can't ignore the cybersecurity angle as well. So we've been building up programs that help people understand that as well. And it's getting that momentum. Louisa said it's continuous, and it is absolutely continuous, because where we are today is not going to be where we are 5 years hence. So people need to keep that educational journey. And it's about understanding the context in which any of this technology is used. So we're doing a lot of member webinars about transformation. We've written a big piece on what transformation is now. And transformation itself is a very dynamic subject. It's not the system development lifecycle that you and I understood when we trained, dare I say it, and I taught people for many years as an IT auditor. It's now very rapid, iterative, very responsive. We live in a very different world, and that's what we've got to take the member journey on. So we're doing a lot of work around that.
Thanks, Clive. And Christian, I can see you just dropped another thought leadership link in. What's the association been doing for members?
So I'm going to drop quite a few links in there actually, because we've got quite a lot of stuff. Yeah, we've got so we started off in 2019. We had a digital mindset pact, which was really about, you know, starting to think about this digital environment that we're working in, the changes that we'd made to our competency framework and syllabus. That was free for our members for about 2 years, but it is still available. We have something really good, the ATF of resources, which is about starting your digital journey. So I'll post that in there in a minute, which talks about automation, blockchain, cybersecurity, data analytics. You know, click on that link and have a look. And then, of course, we have our thought leadership, which I've posted in there. We had a report come out in Reinventing Finance for a Digital World in 2020, and some other bits as well. But we're currently doing research as well, so there'll be more stuff coming out. You know, we're constantly speaking to employers and doing research into you know, the future of finance, so that there will be more stuff coming out in the future as well.
Thanks, Christian. And David, ICAW?
Yes, so I've just reposted some links that I actually originally posted just before we started recording, just to make sure that no people get those. So we've got a few different things going on. First of all, in terms of our qualification, we've been doing quite a lot of work in terms of trying to update and keep our qualifications up to date. And I'm sure that the other institutes will agree that, you know, we do obviously have this difficulty that, you know, syllabuses for qualifications are written well before the qualifications start, and then the qualifications take years to happen. So, you know, we're always trying to stay ahead of that that sort of long lead time. So that has always been a challenge for us. But what we've been doing is not just adding information about emerging technologies, although we have been, you know, adding things like artificial intelligence and blockchain to our syllabuses, but we've also been trying to think about some of the bigger questions of what data analytics means. And in particular, we've been putting more emphasis on things like statistical reasoning and understanding of bias and error, and how omissions in data and problems with data can lead to wrong conclusions. So that kind of higher level statistical reasoning has been something. And we've also been looking actually at getting data analytics into our qualifications in a more direct way. We've partnered with Inflow to actually have data analytics from their platform available in our examinations, to try and basically make the exams a bit more like real life and not a sort of what I would have seen when I qualified, and I think many people would have, which have been these sort of, you get these kind of potted summaries on a written text platform, but, you know, thankfully, our exams were pretty much all online before the pandemic, and we were able to finish up doing that just in time to avoid that particular issue. But we have, also been adding more things, to try and make more realistic data analysis. And then post-qualification, we've equally been doing quite a lot of CPD offerings. We've launched a data analytics certificate last year, and for a data analytics community for kind of sharing and helping people kind of engage with data analytics in various ways. And that's sort of gone on. And then finally, I've worked for my sort of whole time in ICWA. I've been working in the tech faculty, which is where we do our sort of technology related thought leadership. And the link that I shared has included quite a bit of that, in particular looking at things like how technology is transforming audits. I'm currently doing something on technology's transformational effect on tax, and how making tax digital in the UK compares with what other countries are doing, and kind of looking at how technology is transforming tax compliance as well. So really, it's something that's a kind of a substrate that goes over a lot of what we do, as I think you'd expect. It's something that's increasingly reaching into every part of, I think, what we do as a professional body.
That's a really interesting point you pick up there at the end, David, that because what I hear from particularly practice firms that I talk to is that automation, data analytics, they're very relevant in audit, very relevant in kind of business advisory areas, the kind of cloud CFO services that a lot of firms are doing. You're talking there about digital in tax, actually, so that I think will be quite an interesting development. Clive, actually, David was talking there about the way the ICWA is kind of evolving the qualification itself. How are ACCA incorporating these elements?
I guess pretty much the same, and embedding the data analytics modules that actually our members can take separately once they've qualified, back into the qualifications. So you're starting to get that iterative process coming through, and we're very much embedding some of these practical analytical techniques into the various modules through the qualification, as you would expect. And naturally, we keep it under review. As David said, that is, I think, going to be one of the things of the qualification, whichever body you're with, that need to keep particularly the technology and the data angles constantly evolving is highly relevant, and that's what you would expect us to do.
And Christian, CIMA's approach?
Yeah, so I think our last major syllabus update was in 2019, which seems a long time ago now, given that it was pre-pandemic. But our competency framework, we brought the digital element, digital skills into our competency framework, which included things like data strategy and planning, data visualization, those kind of things. There was also some updates to the technical side. Cybersecurity was brought in as a specific skill in the technical side of the competency framework. And this led to updates across the syllabus, incorporating these skills into the qualification. So, for example, data and information in a digital world, which is brought into our enterprise pillar, digital costing, cybersecurity, which sits in our performance pillar, and the dimensions of Gartner data analytics maturity model, which sits in the financial pillar. So there was a reasonable update at that time. As I said, we are currently in the process of researching the next iteration of the qualification. And so this will give us a really good opportunity to see where digital transformation sits in the organization's priorities. Obviously, we want to speak to a lot of employers on that. And, as I mentioned to you earlier, Gareth, we'd love to hear from anybody on this call that would be interested in participating in that research. So I'll post an email address into the chat for anybody who may wish to get in touch on that. But it's a constant process. We're looking at it all the time.
Thanks, Christian. Actually, was mentioned earlier, wasn't it, that one of the challenges I think qualifications have and awarding bodies have is when you've got a relatively slow process of updating a qualification, writing new material, it's really hard to keep on top of some of these changes that are so dynamic. So I think these CPD elements obviously are a bit more fluid and a bit more flexible. And from our perspective, it's great that we see the qualifications themselves building in the, whether it's the technical content or the practical application, particularly for our apprentices, which, probably 85% of our trainees are apprentices now. And we have our Impact Skills program, which also incorporates a lot of digital aspects. And we've spent a lot of time in the last year or year and a half developing our own digital technologies and data analytics programs, which we're actually in the process of our first pilot program for our courses. And actually, Louise, I might bring you in at this stage because we've been working closely with Chris Argent. Some of you may have come across Chris Argent, who runs Generation CFO and is a real thought leader in these areas. And you've been working closely with Chris to develop and start rolling out these pilots, haven't you, Louisa?
I have indeed, and we've actually got one of them underway right this minute, actually, so I'll be hopping over to that shortly. Yeah, so very much in those courses, we're looking at aiming to establish a common language and understanding about very much what we've been speaking about today, and empowering people, helping to make projects more successful and retain talent. And it isn't about the technical language and the tools. We're not recommending tools. It's about very much that journey we've talked about to encompass some of these topics. And we've got a couple of programs that we're kicking off with. One is the awareness of digital finance. And we're looking at the trends, like we talked about, establishing that common language. So understanding what's going on, data analytics, how we're moving towards that predictive, for example, automation, understanding machine learning, what opportunities there are and will be as things change quickly. And then really focusing very much on finance and accounting, the impact on what this means for us in the different areas of practice and industry in terms of the capabilities needed, plus those risks that we've touched on, cybersecurity and the skills and roles for that. And then leading on for that, we've got a more specialist module with understanding data analytics. So very much looking at the 4 levels, moving towards the predictive, and really focusing on data analysis, the process for that. And like I also mentioned earlier, also data visualization. So we're really thinking about how to tell the story and those messages to explain to all the relevant stakeholders.
And we've got some focus groups that we're running to actually talk through our course plans. I mean, we have come up with these over the last year and a half. We hope it will fit the market, but we want to get employer feedback. So I've just posted my email address into the box, which, if anyone is interested in getting involved, feel free to email me. I think we've just had actually the links to some of these focus groups that we've got running. In fact, there's one tomorrow morning to finish off our digital week, and then we've got a couple running in March. We'd be really interested to get people coming along, just give us some feedback on the proposals we've come up with, the course content, the style we're going to be doing it. It'd be really useful to get people's thoughts on that. So feel free to get in touch if you're interested in coming to them or to book onto your places. Other than that, well, we're bang on 1 minute to 10 there. Fantastic, marvelous. Thank you so much to our speakers. What an incredible conversation. I found that really fascinating, actually. I hope even my speakers have actually got some useful information from that. Thanks so much for everyone for attending. We will be running another, I think we'll be running these sorts of digital and data sessions fairly regularly because it is such an emerging, evolving discussion in the finance sector. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, David, Suzanne, for your comments through the chat box. I hope everyone has got some value out of that. But at 1 minute to 10, you can have 1 minute back to your day. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you very much. Have a good day.